Salam indet nacho and welcome back to the channel. With this language review, we're back out of Europe again because this time we're talking about Amharic. I don't have anything else to say in the intro, so let's go! So to start, let's see that history of the language. Amharic, or Amarinya, is a South Semitic language in the Afro-Asiatic language family. South Semitic speakers first crossed the Red Sea from the Arabian Peninsula into East Africa probably a bit before 2000 BC. That language developed into what we know as Ethio-Semitic, and then that grouping split up into North and South Ethiopic. Amharic itself is South Ethiopic and the main language in this portion of northern Ethiopia. And then we hit a bit of a dark period because we don't have written evidence of Amharic until the 1300s AD. That being said, there was a fair amount of literature from the surrounding languages, so there's more evidence of Amharic among those writings, including both descriptions of Amharic and words from Amharic. This phase is sometimes called Old Amharic, even though it's unattested. One of these surrounding languages was Ge'ez, a now extinct North Ethiopic language which has extensive literature dating back to the turn of the calendar, and Amharic now uses its script. But I also can't talk about Amharic's history without mentioning the Cushitic languages, which is another Afro-Asiatic branch that was in East Africa before the Semitic languages arrived, and Amharic took a lot of influence from them. Anyway, the story of how Amharic became the lingua franca of Ethiopia is pretty interesting. Basically, in the 1100s AD, there was a possible royal bastard, in the literal sense of the term, from the Zagwe dynasty named Lalibela, and he wanted to take the throne, which he believed should be his. So he allied with the Amhara people, sound familiar, promising them nobility positions in exchange for their support. This arrangement worked. Lalibela took the throne in 1181, and with all the Amharic nobles, their language became Ethiopia's official language. Ironically though, the Amharic themselves deposed the Zagwe in 1270 when Emperor Ikuno Amlak overthrew them and started the Solomonic dynasty. Amharic had the prestige in Ethiopia throughout the centuries, including that time in the 1800s and 1900s when Ethiopia maintained its sovereignty during the European colonial era. I feel like it'd be wrong not to mention that. So then after a bunch of other stuff happened in the 1900s, naturally, Amharic was named as the official language of Ethiopia in the 1995 constitution. Today, Amharic is still an official language in Ethiopia, although 4 others were added in 2020, and the working language of the Ethiopian government, despite being less spoken than Oromo in the country, interestingly enough. Amharic has about 35 million native speakers, with about 25 million L2 speakers, adding up to approximately 60 million total speakers, enough to be the 34th most spoken language in the world by total speakers, and the second most spoken Semitic language, if you count Arabic as one language. So now after the history, let's see how Amharic sounds. Phonemically, Amharic has 7 vowels and 28 consonants, totaling 35 phonemes. We'll start with the consonants because I know y'all are interested in the rare phonemes. Amharic's rare phonemes are all adjectives, which is the type of non-pulmonic consonant made without the lungs. To make them, you basically start from a regular voiceless plosive, but you move your glottis, the voice box, upwards while you produce the consonant. This effectively causes a glottal stop to go between the consonant and any vowel after it. Amharic has 5 adjectives: bilabial p, alveolar t, velar k, and then 2 affricated adjectives, alveolar t and post-alveolar ch. 4 of these adjectives contrast with regular pulmonic obstruents, b, t, k, and ch, but interestingly, there's no pulmonic t in Amharic. But back to the bilabial adjective p briefly, remember how I said there are 35 phonemes in Amharic? Well, I could have said there are only 32, because p, along with p and v, only occur in recent loanwords. But I had to count them because p happens to occur in the name of the country itself, Ethiopia, along with another fairly common word, terepeza, meaning table. The other 2 loan phonemes are in more obvious loanwords like Jupiter and Venus. But now there's something you may have noticed about some of the consonants. Amharic has consonant gemination, meaning that consonants can be held for twice as long. This may cause a difference in meaning as well, like how gena means not yet, but genna means Christmas. And now that I've said that, I can tell you all about the allophones on Amharic consonants. First, be lenites to an approximate v between vowels, but only when it's not geminated. So for example, in abela, be lenited both times, while in dabbo, it remained a plosive. Also, if n is ungeminated and before an obstruent, it'll match the place of that obstruent. So in wember, there's place assimilation, but in dinbit, there isn't. So now we can talk about the vowels, although there's not much to say. I sorta counts as a rare phoneme, I guess, and as an allophone, it becomes u after w, like in wusha. Also, there's no phonemic vowel length distinction, which is a bit odd considering that the consonants do differ by length sometimes. Amharic is the only language I've studied where this combination is the case. In addition, I'd normally talk about stress rules now, but Amharic just kinda doesn't have stress as a concept. If you listen to Amharic, it sounds like every syllable is both stressed and unstressed. I found it very interesting when I was starting out. And of course, since there's no stress, there's no vowel reduction either. Now let's see what Amharic writing is like. As alluded to earlier, Amharic is written with the Ge'ez abugida. Wait, a Semitic language that doesn't use an abjad and it's written left to right? What's up with that? Well, the Ge'ez script was originally an abjad in the ancient South Arabian family of scripts, and if you think about it, an abugida is just an abjad when they decide to indicate vowels. Ge'ez made the switch sometime in the 300s AD. So anyway, Amharic's version of the Ge'ez abugida uses 34 base letters for the consonants. This includes characters for the 3 consonants that only exist in loanwords, v, p, and p, but that still leaves 6 more characters than consonants for the native phonemes. What happened here is that a few distinct Amharic consonants in the past merged into each other, but their letters all remained. Specifically, these letters are both used for the glottal stop these two both say t, these two say s, and a whole 4 letters, these all say h. Typically, these sets of letters are now interchangeable with each other, like how I've seen mesrat spelled with both the s letters. So now we can talk about the vowel appendages. The default vowel following a consonant letter with no appendage is e, but for the 6 other vowels, here are their basic appendages. U, E, and A are pretty simple and uniform across all the consonant characters, but A, E, and O have a bit of variation depending on the shape of the consonant letter. For A, there are 3 ways this could work out. Some letters simply extend their right leg downward, but for the letters that don't have downward legs, they'll have to invent one. Meanwhile, for the letters that have one singular downward leg, they actually make it curve to the left for the A vowel. I'll skip over to O next, since at first it does the inverse of A. Letters with the option available to them will extend their left leg downward, but as for the other letters, they're somewhat inconsistent. Some of them will slant their singular leg to the left without a curve, so it's different from A, while the other letters add a circle somewhere in their upper part for O. And there are also 2 letters that add a small line to make the O variety, yo and go. This can be confusing because that's very similar to the I appendage, or, one of them. Outside the aforementioned line directly on top or on the upper right, the other varieties of this symbol are either a small line coming off a letter's left side or adding extra squiggles inside a letter's upper part, along with some others. But even with all these guidelines on ligature formation, there are 5 consonant letters that behave extra weirdly. One of them is the aforementioned ye, which makes 2 squiggles for the yi form. Then we have a 2 for ne and nye. Na and no behave similarly, although you'd be forgiven for not realizing they're part of the ne family. Ne also looks a bit weird, and then just add helicopter blades to the top of any of these for the appropriate nye form. Then we got me, where the mi and mo forms are very easy to confuse and somewhat counterintuitive. And finally, possibly the weirdest consonant letter is re. The re, ri, ra, and re forms all look very similar to each other without the appendages you'd expect, and you're not safe with ru either, as it puts the vowel appendage directly below it, not to the right like you'd expect. So now we can finally talk about other orthographic matters. For one, if you had a bracket below any letter, that's how you get a w sound between the consonant and the vowel, like in quankwa, quas, or arenguadi. But what's up with that first letter? Shouldn't it make the S sound? Now we'll get to pronunciation anomalies. First, for 5 of the 6 consonants that make either the h sound or the glottal stop, this one being the exception, they're default ligatures that would normally indicate the e vowel instead say either ha or a. Such examples are ambisa, azzo, allet, habtam, and tehai. How exactly this manifests varies a bit. With these letters, the default ligature has overtaken the real a form, while for these letters, the a form survived and is used way more than the default ligature. For example, alem, uha, and hati'at are pretty much always written with the a form of the relevant letter. The other thing to be aware of when reading Amharic is that if you see a ligature with the I vowel, it could say I, or it could just be the consonant. This is also how Amharic represents a consonant with no vowel after it, either in a consonant cluster like mebrek, or at the end of a word like nib. In fact, you'll basically never see I at the end of a word, so there, you'll know it's just the consonant. For consonant clusters, though, you'll just have to recognize patterns. One of these is that geminated consonants tend to have vowels on both sides of them, although not always. So like in dimmet, we know the d character has a vowel, but this doesn't work for genda, that's just a cluster. But how do you know where gemination goes anyway? I'll now finish this section in the worst way possible. Gemination is not represented in Amharic writing. You'll just have to learn that on each word. In case you're wondering, I mark gemination with a colon on my vocab list. So after that disappointing ending to the orthography, let's move on to the sentence structure. In a move that's uncommon for Semitic languages, Amharic's default word order is SOV, or subject-object-verb, which it picked up from the Cushitic languages. For a basic example sentence, we have Sigaw kesahne bikirbu yiberral. This means the meat will fly off my plate soon. Word for word, it's subject, prepositional object, adverb that's irrelevant right now, verb, SOV. You might also see OSV in some sentences with stressed objects, or maybe because the object is a subordinate clause, and and you want to keep the main verb subject next to it. We'll talk more about that in the verb section. So now about other parts of the sentence structure. Adjectives go before the noun, as do all numbers, and supplemental nouns go before the main noun. But to finally be presented with evidence that this is still a Semitic language, Amharic uses prepositions, the ones that go before the noun phrase, although there's a caveat that the words wust, wuch, and lai, meaning inside, outside, and on, are actually nouns, not adpositions, so they go after, like with Ethiopia wust, in Ethiopia, which literally means something like in Ethiopia interior. And finally, Amharic is pro-drop, so you can drop unnecessary subject pronouns. So now we'll talk about the nouns. Amharic nouns are inflected for two numbers, singular and plural, and divided into two genders, masculine and feminine, except that gender system is on the way out now. I've mentioned this in a previous video as well, but basically, over time, Amharic's gender system has been shifting from a true arbitrary masculine-feminine system, like you find in the other Semitic languages, to a depleted masculine-feminine system in which the vast majority of inanimate nouns are masculine, even if they were grammatically feminine before. The number of inanimate nouns that are still grammatically feminine is very small, but there are some of them, like tahai, mekina, and ketama. Nouns referring to humans and animals with a known gender still take their real-life gender though, so like wend is still masculine and sit is still feminine. For other human nouns, you may have the option to add the characteristically Semitic t suffix to make it feminine, like memhir, male teacher, to memhirt, female teacher. But you also have the option to just say wend memhir and sit memhir, literally male teacher and female teacher, or you could just not do any of that and let the articles and verbs carry the weight of gender inflection, spoiler alert. But this system also has a weird side effect. Many inanimate Amharic nouns have that t suffix to indicate femininity, but due to the aforementioned changes, that suffix has now been rendered mostly insignificant despite still being there itself. For example, amet, duket, and wetet were all historically feminine as the suffix on them indicates, but now they're masculine since they're all inanimate objects. There's an interesting case to be made with animals though. When you don't know the gender of a specific animal, many of them are feminine by default, like inkorarit and kebero. This whole gender simplification thing is something I suspected was going on when I was first learning Amharic, so I'm glad there was an academic paper to prove my suspicions. It's linked in the description box. So as for other things about Amharic nouns, how do they pluralize? For most of them, it's pretty easy. You just add the suffix och, like dib to divoch and wens to wenzoch. If the noun ends with a vowel, it'll probably pluralize with woch instead, like sheleko to shelekwoch and tenagari to tenagariwoch. But it could also just cut out the final vowel, like wusha to wushoch and terara to teraroch. There are some older irregular patterns though, mostly using the at suffix instead, like kal to kalat or negus to negastat. Some human nouns may also take an an suffix like kiddus to kiddusan, but these forms are getting regularized, part of my most popular videos about regularization. So to finish the nouns, there are two case inflections to talk about. First is the accusative, which is the suffix n, but it only goes on nouns with the definite article, and that's something we'll talk about in the next section. Subject pronouns can also take it, although they have other strategies. The other one is the genitive, or I guess you could just call it possessive, which is made with the prefix ye, although it's actually eclitic since it goes before the whole noun phrase. This possessed noun then goes before the main noun. So now it's time for the pronouns, and if you're thinking, but didn't you just say the articles were next? Be patient, they're included in here. So first, here's the big chart of Amharic pronouns, and I'll point some things out. As you can see, the chart is organized into the subject pronouns and two varieties of object pronoun, which both come in the form of suffixes. The first one is the suffix you'd put on a noun to show pronominal possession. This works for both singular and plural nouns, but just like with the plural suffix itself, if a singular noun ends with a vowel, then some of the suffixes will change. Specifically, the first person singular suffix e will add an epenthetic y before it, like how shadow is tilla and my shadow is tillaye. Meanwhile, the third person masculine singular suffix is normally u, but it becomes the consonant w after a vowel, so his shadow is tillau. I'll also mention here that the third person feminine singular suffix is wa, which is logically spelled with the wa ligature after a vowel, but for consonants, this is probably the most predictable place to see the w bracket on a letter. So her shadow, for example, is tillawa, but her house is betwa, check the last letter. And I mentioned these two possessive suffixes specifically because these are also the definite articles. When I promise, I deliver. They match up with the gender of the possessive pronouns, so tillau could be either his shadow or just the shadow. The house, likewise, is betu, which also means his house, since it's also masculine. To give the elusive feminine examples, the city is ketamawa, while the frog is inkoraritwa. So how about the other object pronouns? Those go on the ends of verbs to indicate the object, so like, I heard you is semmahu to a male listener, and semmahush to a female listener. Most of them are the same as the possessive suffixes, but there are a few important differences, namely, first person singular being being ing instead of a, third person feminine singular being at instead of wa, and first person plural being just n instead of achin. By the way, te will replace u for third person masculine singular if the verb already ends with u. We'll talk more about those in the verb section. A weird thing is that these don't go on prepositions like you'd expect. Those tend to use the subject pronoun for their conjugations. At this point, I'll also mention that there are formal pronouns, but I've rarely seen them used. And finally, there are also a few demonstrative pronouns, which are modified for gender and number. There are two levels in Amharic, proximal and distal, and these pronouns can also be used as demonstrative articles which go before the noun phrase. Now we're at the numbers, so here's 1 through 10 in Amharic. There's not that much to talk about here, although be aware that some numbers have multiple possible spellings. The numbers don't inflect for anything outside of 1, and, which has a feminine form, andit, although it only seems to be used on naturally feminine nouns, so you have anditset, but andketema. Also, nouns are pluralized like normal, regardless of a numeral's presence. However, if you speak another Semitic language, you may be wondering why these numbers look so unfamiliar, like, shouldn't there be more cognates? Well, these numbers actually are cognates with those of other Semitic languages, with the exceptions of 2, hulet, which comes from a Proto-Semitic word meaning both, and 9, zetain, which I have no idea the origin of. The other numbers have just been severely reduced throughout history. But don't fear, I'm about to show you something fascinating. Here are the tens. For several of them, this word, after being multiplied by 10, looks closer to the other Semitic numbers than the actual Amharic words for those numbers. Just something I found weird when I was learning Amharic. Anyway, to form a 2-digit number, you simply say the tens number and then the ones number, nothing too hard. Even 11 through 19 is relatively straightforward. The only change is that 10 asr becomes asra. And finally, here are the ordinal numbers. They're all just the number with the adjectival suffix enya at the end. Speaking of which, here are the adjectives. Surprisingly, Amharic adjectives do not inflect for gender or number in any position. However, there is at least one interesting thing to mention. When an adjective is in a noun phrase and the noun happens to be definite, the adjective will take the definite suffix. For example, black hair in Amharic is tikurut agur, but the black hair is tikurut agur. The article went on the word for black, not hair. Weirdly, the article in this case always seems to be masculine regardless what the noun is. Other than that, there's not much to say about adjectives. They don't officially have an adverbial pattern, but if you want, you can always put the preposition be before the adjective and end it with the definite suffix, effectively meaning of the adjective. And finally, there are no comparative or superlative forms either. So now we're at the verbs, but before talking about them, I gotta reintroduce the Semitic triconsonantal root system. Normally I would have talked about it earlier, but here I couldn't, because in addition to not having to explain why abjads work for Semitic languages, that system is almost never used in Amharic for inflections, only derivations. The exception to this is verbs. So basically, Semitic words are formed by combining two elements, a root made up of 3 consonants, sometimes 4, sometimes 2 for historical reasons, which holds the lexical meaning, which you put into a pattern, the surrounding vowels and affixes, and this holds the grammatical meaning. So for our first example of a pattern, let's look at the infinitive verbs. Amharic infinitive verbs are put into a template starting with me or ma, and this leads into the discussion of verb classes. In the other 2 Semitic languages I've made language overviews of, there were massive verb class systems to talk about, and I spent a while trying to figure out if I should present Amharic like that as well. But ultimately I decided against it because all Amharic verbs keep a pretty consistent internal structure throughout their conjugations, and there would be a lot of verb classes if I did this. So going back to the infinitives, one thing to notice is that if a verb's infinitive form starts with ma, then all its conjugations will retain that a vowel at their beginnings. Examples are mamlet, mafker, mamen, mastemar, and magnet. And within these examples, we can see some other quirks to be aware of. The first 2 of these example verbs are the most normal ones, while mamen is also fairly normal, it just has the glottal stop as its first root letter, or radical. However, mastemar, which means teach, can effectively be seen as an optative version of another verb, memmar, which means learn. The standout feature of this class is the st toward the beginning. It's related to class 10 from Arabic. In addition, just infixing as can be causative, like how memser means look like, but masmesel means pretend. So then what's weird about magnet? Just like in other Semitic languages, that t at the end is a disappearing final radical. That suffix in the infinitive will disappear in most conjugations, which I'll be sure to cover throughout this section. By the way, the suffix may also appear as at, like in meblat or mansat. So now let's get into conjugations. In order to cover all the bases, the example verbs will be mesber, mejemmer, mennager, mamlet, magnet, meblat, and mehid. The first conjugation we'll look at is the subjunctive non-past. For clarification, this is the non-past tense, which includes both the present and future, when the verb is in a subordinate clause. It has nothing to do with the uncertainty of the verb like with the subjunctive in various European languages. So anyway, here's mesper. I know, basic choice, everyone uses it, but it works well and it's recognizable to other Semitic language speakers. As far as what we can see here, there's a bit of a shift with vowels from the infinitive, which is the main characteristic of the root and pattern system. The second and third person singular are split up by gender, which is also very Semitic. The personal agreements are made primarily with the prefixes, while some of them have suffixes to either indicate the second person feminine singular or the second and third person plural. So now we'll look at majemmer, which effectively behaves the same with one difference. Just as the middle me is geminated in the infinitive, it's geminated in the non-past. A similar thing happens to mennager, where the internal structure is somewhat retained in the non-past, including that a vowel. So now we get to mamlet with the ma at the beginning. All the prefixes keep that a there, including first person singular, which switched the I out for a, as in amelt. I also chose this verb specifically to clarify that adjective t does not count as a disappearing final radical. Speaking of which, here's magnet, which does have the disappearing final radical. The a is still there, while the t isn't. That I find is again. A similar thing happens to meblat, but there's a very important difference. Since the infinitive suffix is at rather than et, the a stays on the end of the non-past form, so that I eat is ibela. So then our final example verb is mehed, just to make sure I include the short two root verbs. They're pretty simple, there's nothing too surprising on this chart. However, I do need to mention negation now, as it slightly varies by conjugation. But this is interesting. Generally in Amharic, negation comes in the form of a circumfix, that being a prefix and suffix that act together for one purpose. Specifically, to any of the subjunctive non-past verb conjugations I just showed, add a to the beginning and to the end. So for example, he doesn't break is aisebrim, and we don't start is anjemmirim. The one oddity here is that the first person singular adds le in there, so I don't talk is alenagirim. By the way, if there's an object pronoun on the verb, it'll slip in before the Here's how that looks in the affirmative, and here's the negative. And now I'll finally answer the question that's probably been bothering y'all. Why didn't I start with the non-past conjugation for main clauses? Wouldn't that be more logical? Normally yes, but not in Amharic, because the main clause non-past is formed off of the subjunctive non-past. You basically take the appropriate subjunctive form and add the appropriately conjugated form of alle to the end. Alle itself is an irregular verb meaning something along the lines of be here, be there, be present, stuff like that, and it is used on its own for that purpose. It can also mean have if you put a verbal object suffix on it. By the way, here it's negative forms. But here's what it looks like added onto the end of non-past mesber, indicating that this is the main verb in the clause, and as a result, likely the last word in the sentence overall. Some things to notice. First, the e suffix from the second person feminine singular stays there when the suffix is added, but the u suffix on two of the plural forms disappears. Also, despite the verb alle itself having a vowel on the end of the third person masculine singular form, it loses this vowel as the suffix on a longer verb. The il is still geminated though. And finally, the first person singular suffix is spelled allehu, but these days it's pretty much always pronounced allo, so that's how I wrote it in IPA. So here are the charts for majemmer, mennager, mamlet, magnet, meblat, and mehed. But now that we've seen those, I'll bring the object pronouns back up because they do something weird here. They stay where they were on the subjunctive form and the alle suffix goes after them. So, you break me is tsebrinjallesh. Also, there are no unique negative forms for the main clause verbs, you just use the same ones formed off the subjunctive. Now we can talk about the past tense, so here's mesber again. As you can see, the middle root letter is always geminated here, regardless what the infinitive looks like. As opposed to the non-past, the past is characterized by using exclusively suffixes for the personal agreements. This includes the e vowel at the end of the third person masculine singular form, which I was always forgetting about when I started with Amharic, so this is just a friendly warning. Before moving on to other verbs, I'll point out specifically sebberku and sebberk. Remember those. There's nothing special to talk about with majemmer, but then for mennager, there's a te prefix in the past which happens when the first radical is geminated. And for mamlet, remember to keep the a on there. But then we get to magnet, and look at those two conjugations we just talked about. Instead of ku and k, I found is agenyehu, and you masculine found is agenye. This is something that happens with disappearing te, so the same thing applies to meblat seen here. But then with mehed, we're back to normal. And to add the negative circumfix to a past tense verb, it's basically the same as for the non-past, but the prefix portion is always al. So now, just like there was a second type of non-past, there's also a second type of past tense. It's called the conjunct past, and it's used to indicate an action that happened before the action described by the main verb, much like the perfect tenses you may be more familiar with. Here's what it looks like. It's also defined by suffixes, but these suffixes are different, while the internal pattern has also changed. Here's majemmer, mennager, mamlet, magnet, meblat, and mehed. But despite being primarily used in subordinate clauses, as I implied earlier, the conjunct can be used as the main verb of sentence. You'll just have to add the alle suffix to the end. In this case, it takes the role of a present perfect, so seberreallo means I have broken. By the way, there's no negative for the conjunct, you just use the regular past tense forms with the negative circumfix. So now we have the final primary conjugation category, or rather, two of them that work in tandem with each other. The first one you're definitely familiar with. It's the imperative or command form. It only has forms for the second person, and it's pretty basic. basic. You just take this form, which is masculine singular, and then you add an e suffix to make it feminine and an u suffix to make it plural. However, there's another mood that goes with this, the jussive mood, which indicates a command outside of the second person. Conveniently, since the jussive has everything except the second person, it fits right into the imperative chart, which is how it always should have been represented. It also fits the same pattern as the imperative conjugations, and the only deviation from the personal prefixes on the non-past is that the first person singular form starts with le, so let me break is lisper. And to negate any of these conjugations, you actually only use the prefix portion of the negative circumfix from the non-past verbs. Notably for the second person conjugations, the t is back. Here's mejemmer, mennager, mamlet, magnet, meblat, and mehed with a vowel change. So those are all the main conjugations, but there are a few more constructions to tell you all about. One of them is that Amharic has a progressive construction for an action in progress. To make it, you take the appropriately conjugated past tense form of the verb and add the prefix iye, which will become iya for verbs that start with a, you know the drill. This form is called the present participle. Then after it, you put the word now, which means is, regardless who the subject of the sentence is, although you can make it a past progressive by using nebere instead. We'll talk more about the verb be later. Next, to make a relative verb, as in the person who does something, you add the prefix ye to the verb. So for example, an eagle that ate a fish is asayebella nissir, literally fish that ate eagle. It's effectively an adjective noun phrase. This can also be negated, so an eagle that didn't eat a fish is asayalbella nissir. You just add al in there with no suffix. If you're doing this for non-past verbs though, you'll need to extend the prefix to yemme. So an eagle that eats fish is asayemme bella nissir. Along similar lines, there's a while prefix si, so while I escape is samelt, and me not escaping is salamelt, along with an if prefix ke. And there's also a gerund. It's basically the third person masculine singular conjunct past form. Here are the example verbs. And there are two more forms that are probably familiar as well. There's the passive participle, which is an adjective made with the suffix wal on the verb root, and the active participle, which is in this template that normally ends with e. And finally for the verb section, as you'd expect, the verb mehon, meaning be, follows its own rules. First, as hinted at earlier, these are the present tense conjugations for main clauses, and no, you can't drop it from a sentence where it belongs. And I can say present tense for this one because for the future tense, believe it or not, you conjugate the verb regularly. This is the only time where those two tenses are separate in Amharic. And then you take the alla off the end of this form for the present or future tense if the verb goes in a subordinate clause. Meanwhile, for the negative, the future tense does it exactly as you'd expect it, being alhonim, atonim, and the like. But for the present tense, the negative is entirely suppleted in the forms of idellum, idellahim, and so on. The past tense is also suppleted, formed off a base of nebbere, and then negation works normally in this tense. Now for the miscellaneous section, there is one thing to talk about, and it's the word for and, which behaves pretty interestingly. By itself, the word is inna, and it mostly behaves how you'd expect, going between words or phrases that both apply to the statement. However, if it's connecting individual words, then it'll attach to the previous word as the suffix na. So for example, bread and butter is dabonnak ebe. So after all that, we can finish with our example sentences. The first one is Yezhonun samayawi terasin dalen. This means we like the elephant's blue pillow. First off, in the complicated starting phrase Yezhonun samayawi teras, the first word is Yezhonun. The center of it is zehon, the masculine noun meaning elephant. But at the beginning, there's the possessive ye prefix, and at the end, there are two suffixes, u for the definite article and n for the accusative case, which only appears with the definite article, and both these suffixes apply to the whole noun phrase. There are two main takeaways from this arrangement. First, possessive noun phrases count as adjectives, and second, the article and accusative suffixes only go on the first of the adjectives in a noun phrase, not each adjective. This is why the next word, semayawi, is undeclined. By the way, it means blue and is formed off the noun semai, meaning sky, with the adjectival suffix awi. So then we have the noun teras, meaning pillow. It's masculine, as you'd expect from an inanimate noun, but that's not super relevant here. So finally, we have the verb innewedallen. It's the main clause non-past conjugation of melded, which means like. The d in the middle is geminated because both the last two radicals are within it. As such, to indicate that it's first person plural, there's both the inne prefix and the n on the end of the alle portion. The other example sentence is Gundanoch bet ambe adegenyao ieneddacho indehoneasewu. This means ants thought the y'all were driving too dangerously. We start with gundanoch, which is the plural of gundan, meaning ant. Perfectly normal. After that, there's an adverb phrase, betam be'adegenyao. Betam just means either very or to, and be'adegenyao is the adverb meaning dangerously. Here we find another adjective suffix, as this is basically the noun adega, meaning danger, with the enya suffix, the same one as in all the language names, and then be and u, so that it's an adverb. So next, we have ieneddacho indehone, a progressive phrase. Neddacho is the second person plural past conjugation of men endat, meaning drive. Notice the disappearing te on the end, and it has the eye prefix for the present participle. As for the copula portion, it's indehone, which is hone, the subjunctive past tense of mehon, be, third person masculine singular, because it always is in progressive constructions, with inde before it because it's a straight that clause. So then finally, there's asewu, the third person plural main clause past tense conjugation of maseb, which means think. No prefix, but a geminated middle radical just as you'd expect, and the personal agreement is shown on the suffix. In the end, ብዙ ተናጋሪዎች ቢኖሩትም እና የሱ ዘመዶች ተምሬ አማርኛ በጣም የማይታወቅ ነው። በጣም ጥቂት ስለሱ ምንጮች አሉ እና የትርጉም መተግበሪያዎች ከሰዋስው ጋር በጣም የማይጣጣም ናቸው። ሳይት ኤክስ ለመማር የተጠቀምኩት ዋናው መተግበሪያ አሁን የለም፣ ግን በከብዙ ኢትዮጵያውያን ጋር ከተማ ውስጥ ስለምኖር አስቀድሞ በአማርኛ ንግግሮች ሰርያለሁ። ሁሉም ከ6 ዓመታት በፊት ቢሆኑም እና አሁን የጠናሁት እውነታ ማምለጥ አልችልም፣ ምክንያቱም በኢትዮጵያዊ ምግብ ቤት የሆንኩ በእያንዳንዱ ጊዜ ጥብስ ማስወጣቱን ብሎ እጠይቃለሁ። ለማንኛውም ይህ ቪዲዮ በቂ ነብሮ ተስፋ አደርጋለሁ፣ ግን ካልሆነ የአስተያየት ክፍል አለ። ውደዱና ደንበኛ ሁኑ እና ስለተመለከቱ አመሰግናለሁ።